Beginner's Heaven is a straightforward Gunstar Heroes copycat by the Wild Arms developer Media Vision. It was a launch title in Europe, so it's kind of understandable that a glorified SNES game got left in the dust by the shiny new 3D games. It's a shame though, as a properly developed sequel with Symphony of the Night level pixel art and upgrade systems would have been amazing. Even as it is, the game is great, albeit somewhat unambitious. The weapon system is different from Gunstar Heroes. You have 2 different characters, each with 4 unique weapons that they can use whenever they want. You must collect power-up icons to boost your weapons, because as the timer runs out, your weapons become less effective. You also have bombs. Movement-wise, your characters are quite agile. They can latch onto surfaces, do a slide move, and best of all, they've got a bionic commando-style hook they can use to quickly reach higher areas. This increases the skill ceiling of this game, as you can use it for dodging enemy bullets as well. The action is fast-paced, and thankfully there aren't many bullet sponge enemies, so you can really feel powerful as you plow through standard enemies. It's a hidden gem. But the lack of a co-op and unimpressive graphics prevent it from being a must-play title in the genre. Gunforce 2 is basically a prototype Metal Slug. You've got similar weapons and vehicles you can ride, the bosses are very large and detailed, plus you save women instead of hippies. It lacks the humor of Metal Slug, and the art style is grittier and more dull, but it definitely laid the foundation for the series, as it was made by the same developers. Even though it was released in '94, this game is pure 80s badassery. The action never ceases. You go from fighting bad guys on top of a train, to riding a tank, to this. Being made by Irem, you'd think that the game would kick you in the face with its difficulty the moment you start playing. But actually the game isn't as relentless as the Metal Slug games. Sure, the bosses have a few hard-to-dodge abilities, but due to your ability to cling to ceilings, the difficulty is manageable and fun. You have to stay sharp, but the game doesn't expect you to have lightning-fast reflexes. The enemies also contribute to this well-designed difficulty curve. Although standard goons aren't visually interesting, some of them bring new abilities to the gameplay, like these enemies that force you to jump from one metal chain to another. It's this variety that keeps Gunforce 2 from becoming stale. Biomechanical Toy is, in my opinion, one of the biggest hidden gems in the genre. The level design is really unique. The first few stages have this trippy Alice in Wonderland style to them, while one of the bosses is a computer virus that explodes into ones and zeros upon dying. I get a strong jazz jackrabbit vibe from the overall style of the game. I don't know what exactly it is about the graphics and the music, but the first time I played this game, I immediately sensed that it was made by a European developer. Sure enough, it was developed by a Spanish studio called Zeus Software. But the levels aren't nice only because they look pretty. They also incorporate a fair bit of platforming, and you can jump on top of enemies as well. Like I mentioned in the beat-em-ups video, I like it when straightforward action games like this factor in the environment to the gameplay. Genre mixing can be bad when it's done half-assedly, but I don't sense anything wrong with it when it actually adds to the gameplay and turns level designers into game designers rather than landscape architects. Sadly, you really don't have a weapon selection. You can only pick up more powerful ammo, but the shooting feels quite satisfying, especially thanks to the lock-on ability that allows you to rapidly fire at enemies that are clinging to the ceiling or some other hard-to-reach area. The only complaint I really have is the fact that in the final stages, you often spawn next to a huge crowd of enemies if you die. but the game is generous with checkpoints, and your character is agile enough to avoid many enemies. If you want to nitpick the design, you could say that the game sometimes makes it too easy to run past enemies, as areas that lock down until you clear the area are quite rare, but I don't really feel that way myself. There's enough variety in the stages, level design, and enemy selection to keep things fresh even with the game's shortcomings. Steam Gear MASH is a cutesy hybrid of isometric platforming and run-and-gun gameplay. The levels can be somewhat confusing as they branch into all directions. As you explore the levels, you come across new weapons and skills. Weapons can be used to destroy boxes that block your way, and each weapon has its own corresponding color that it can destroy. Skills, on the other hand, can be chosen by pressing the left shoulder button and used by pressing the right one. There are different movement options that let you stay locked on target, spin around, or walk in an opposite direction while you're shooting. It's nice that the Saturn's controllers have a larger amount of buttons. It's left to the player to choose whether or not to use free firing or locked aiming. It's a fairly short game, and is more generous with health than arcade shooters. But if you die, you lose all progress and have to load a save, which counterbalances this issue and makes you play more carefully. There are some really interesting shooters in the X68000 library, like Dive Onwelt. It's an Alien Syndrome type top-down shooter where you explore maze-like levels with an AI-controlled sidekick character. You also pick up new weapons and gadgets along the way. The enemies respawn, but you have regenerating health to make up for that. Visually, the game is pretty nice, and it seems to rank up pretty high with X68000 games. But I've never gotten very far due to the fact that it's in Japanese, and the gameplay isn't good enough that I'd have the patience for a lot of trial and error. However, if I'm not mistaken, there's a translation project going on. So with English text, I can imagine the experience being a lot more enjoyable when you can actually understand what's going on. Chaos Engine is a rarity among the CD32 library for the fact that the developers actually put effort into porting it from the Amiga to CD. There's a voiced intro and simultaneous music and sound effects. Most of the games on the system have a floppy disk game the size of a few megs filling an entire CD. Anyway, the game itself is also something to get excited about. There are 6 different characters to choose from, each with their own weapon and special attacks. If you play solo, you'll have an AI partner hanging around with you, but there's an option for 2-player co-op. Levels aren't linear like in many arcade games. Instead, you have to activate and pick up keys to open the pathways. You can upgrade your character between levels with the coins you collect. The only flaw with this game is how stiff the controls are, so you kind of have to inch forward carefully in order to avoid running straight into enemy fire. The shoulder buttons turn your character 45 degrees, but I wish they were used for strafing instead. So playing this with a CD32 controller's stiff D-pad can be somewhat frustrating, but if you've got an SNES or a Genesis controller adapter and a buddy to play with, the co-op should be pretty sweet. Demon Front is an unashamed Metal Slug copy made by a Chinese company called Irrational Game Systems. The art style is cartoony, some of the enemy designs are humoristic. There are 2 male and 2 female characters, and you automatically perform a melee attack if you press fire when standing right next to an enemy. There aren't any grenades or vehicle sections, nor things like zombification from Metal Slug 3. Instead, you have a pet that can do a charge shot or give you a shield. On top of that, you can hover in the air to make longer jumps, and you have a health bar. So you'd think that the game would be much easier than Metal Slug. And it is to some extent. But still, there are bosses and sections in the latter stages of the game that force you to go into full survival mode and act like Rambo if you want to survive for more than just a few seconds. It's quite impressive how well this game mimics the Metal Slug style, even down to animations. The shotgun feels really good to use, and your shield clearly indicates when it's about to give up. Of course, the sprites aren't quite as detailed and well animated as in Metal Slug, but the backgrounds are very pretty and colorful. Some might call this a Chinese knockoff, but honestly, it's not like the market's flooded with well-made Metal Slug copycats. Even though it's technically less ambitious and more limited in its design than the Metal Slug games, Demon Front still wipes the floor with so many of the banal 3D games that filled the action game genre when 2D became passé. I don't know if Abuse is the first of its kind, but it must be one of the first side-scrollers to feature mouse aiming. It plays a bit like Metroid would if you were able to aim in different directions from where you're heading. You can use the arrow keys for movement and interacting with objects, and the mouse for aiming, shooting, switching between weapons, and triggering power-ups. The gameplay is very straightforward. You mostly just shoot enemies and flip switches to open doors and teleporters. It's a shareware game, so visually it's not up to the standards of contemporary high-budget games. The character design looks like they were copied from Predator and Alien. The concept of adding mouse aim to a side-scrolling run-and-gun game seems like it has some potential, and it's interesting to think what would have happened if this concept had been invented earlier, before first-person shooters became popular. Would this niche have established itself as its own legitimate genre? The only other games like Abuse that I know are even more amateurish shareware titles. It seems like when these games got any kind of budget, they always go for an isometric or a top-down view instead. Silhouette Mirage might just be Treasure's most odd and experimental game. It's not a full-blown Contra-style run-and-gun, but I don't know what else to classify it as. The main gameplay mechanic revolves around an Ikaruga-style color division between enemies. Your character is red when facing right, and blue when facing left. If you're blue, you can't damage a blue enemy, and vice versa. However, you can drain an enemy of the same color from their mana points by attacking them. You can also grab enemies and punch them to make them drop coins or push them off ledges. These coins can be used for buying and upgrading moves, but to be honest, I could never figure out the intricacies of this game due to the fact that I imported a Japanese copy because it's the preferred version. To quote a GameStop review from 2000, the game has somehow transformed from a delightfully quirky platforming romp into an average, unbalanced, and tedious exercise meant for quote-unquote hardcore gamers. So I'm not really qualified to talk about this game, but I just wanted to mention it as it seems interesting and it has its own fanbase. FixEight is notable for the fact that it was made by the shoot-'em-up developer Taoplan. It has 8 different characters, all of whom have their unique weapons and pickups. There's a robot, a lizard, hovering genie who can ricochet lasers through corners, a ninja who throws shurikens, and 3 more normal characters. They all play differently. For example, some can shoot in any direction you want, while others can't move backwards. I like the fact that even though there's a limited amount of space in these levels, some still have 2 or 3 different routes at once. There's also pitfalls, so you aren't just running forward constantly in this game. Visually, the game is kinda drab, but the gameplay is engaging enough that you'll hardly have time to even notice it. The fact that it was developed by a company known for its shoot-'em-ups shows in the fact that many enemies shoot waves of projectiles. Taoplan also made a game called Outzone 2 years earlier. It's harder and only has one character, but has better music, and I actually think it has better graphics as well. Just look at how finely animated these explosions are. You can't get much more 90s than Dinosaurs for Hire. You play as a gun-wielding dinosaur clad in a leather jacket and sunglasses. You could ask why a dinosaur would need a gun to defeat unarmed human beings, but why bring logic into this? Besides its dinosaurs theme, this game is a very typical Genesis shooter. The graphics are kinda dark and muddy, and the soundtrack is as forgettable as it is repetitive. There's nothing wrong in the gameplay, but it also doesn't bring anything new. It's kind of underwhelming when you take into consideration that Gunstar Heroes came out the same year, but as a budget purchase, it offers some decent action. Night Slave is a mech run-and-gun in the vein of Cybernator, or Aquales. You can glide and equip your mech with different weapons, some of which have recoil. This game doesn't bring anything new to the genre, but it has a shoot-'em-up style upgrade bar, which gives it some personality. When you collect these pickups, they increase the meter, and you can decide what to buy, more health or firepower. It's a nice thing that these symbols are in English. Despite the fact there's a fair bit of dialogue in this game, you can play it without knowing a word of Japanese. I don't know if it's a doujin game, but it feels like it. You can run past many enemies, and some of the bosses have blind spots, so it doesn't feel carefully designed, but gameplay-wise it's still above many similar games seen on other home computers. Another reason why this feels like a doujin game is the fact that there's some risque content that happens in these visual novel parts between the levels, so be warned. I have to say, from a technical point of view, these Japanese PC games have always impressed me. Even though these scenes obviously sacrifice interactivity for graphical fidelity, the image quality is super sharp in most of NEC, Sharp, and FM Towns games that I've seen. It makes you wonder what could have been, had Japan had a similar PC gaming scene as America had at the time. Apogee's Biomenace is a mediocre Commander Keen style platformer / run-and-gun hybrid. You go around shooting enemies and rescuing people, and there really isn't that much else I can say about this game. The death animations are more gory and detailed than in other similar Shareware games. It's no masterpiece, but if you're nostalgic for Commander Keen and would like to play something in its style, Biomenace is a good pick.
Shock Troopers Second Squad.
Shock Troopers Second Squad is visually a very unique title due to its mix of 2D and pre-rendered graphics. It's one of those late 90s Neo Geo games that tried to keep up with the times by including some bad voice acting and switching to a Donkey Kong Country-esque graphical style.
No much for me. Select mission. Airbase recovery operation. Let's go. No margin for forgiveness in the battlefield.
While the end result is more blurry and less appealing than a pure 2D game would have been, I appreciate the effort and what the developers achieved with hardware from 1990. This style also led to some interesting level design, as levels aren't linear treks from left to right or bottom to top like in many other arcade shooters. The firing system works so that once you keep the fire button pressed, your character's aim becomes locked, and you can keep shooting while focusing on avoiding enemy projectiles. This can feel weird at first, but it's a great quality of life feature. I'm sure that everyone who has played Metal Slug 2 wishes you could lock onto a position so that you don't have to jump every time you want to shoot down. Of course, the systems aren't directly comparable, as Shock Troopers uses a top-down view. It's actually one of the weaknesses of the game. It can sometimes be hard to tell whether or not you can avoid a barrage of bullets by jumping due to the weird camera angle. But it's only a minor nitpick. You hardly notice it in the earlier stages, especially when you have bombs. Each character has their own bomb and weapon, so they all play slightly differently. One character uses a laser, while another has a spread shot. All characters can also perform a melee attack when standing next to an enemy. The character roster has been trimmed down to 4 from the original game's 8, but it's really not a problem when each one feels different to play. You can find Shock Troopers' second squad from the MVS multicart, but sadly the original game isn't included here. If you're looking for more run-and-gun games for the system besides the Slug games, Neo Geo also has Cyberlip and NAM 1975.
Level Pep up, rock with the beat.
There's a reason why Obliterator is largely forgotten. There's only one song and the gameplay is slow and annoying. It's only notable for its cool alien-inspired box art and for having detailed character animations like in a cinematic platformer. Games based on obscure movies or TV shows that didn't last long are always interesting relics. Cowboy Zam Mesa is a surprisingly solid game, even if it doesn't really offer anything new to the genre. There are no health pickups, and your only special move is a bull rush that you can perform by simultaneously pressing the fire and jump buttons. But isn't used all that much in the design. It's a fairly easy game, but bosses can take quite a few hits. So it's fun to challenge yourself and see if you can beat them without taking any hits. One notable feature is the inclusion of voice acting, which isn't very common in arcade games of the era. Every boss has something to say, and the cartoon's theme song plays in the level selection screen. I haven't watched the show enough to tell you whether or not these are the same voice actors from the show. It's no Sunset Riders, but you could do a lot worse. Whether the cartoony aesthetic and occasional weirdness detracts from the experience or makes it better is up to the player to decide. Elevator action returns might sound boring, but it's actually a surprisingly entertaining game. It's very similar in concept to 80s games like Impossible Mission, Lode Runner, and Castles of Dr. Creep, as the game is screen-based rather than a side-scroller. You traverse levels that are filled with elevators, and your goal is to unlock these red doors. Due to the timing element and the fact that you take fall damage, the gameplay is more methodical and reminiscent of titles like Darkthorn. The art style is also really cool. It evokes a lot of 80s visuals in delightfully high detail. Choin is a really simple survival style game. You've got a flamethrower and a shield. You have to survive against a wave of aliens that get tougher and tougher with each round. Games like this have the potential to be really addicting, like the Galaxy Monkey minigame in Ape Escape. However, this one doesn't hold my interest for long, as the control scheme is kind of weird. When you go in the opposite direction, the controls get flipped, which is really confusing. I suppose playing with a joystick might alleviate this problem.
Bad pirate.
Zombies Ate My Neighbors is fairly well known, so I won't go into too much detail about it. The game takes every imaginable classic and cliched movie monster and throws them in a suburban setting, where you have to rescue people and fend for yourself using fire extinguishers, soda cans, squirt guns, and other everyday objects. Some are powerful against specific enemies, others have specific uses, like you can shoot walls open with a bazooka. You also have consumable health kits, keys, potions that turn you into a monster that you can use strategically. As there's no predefined path in the levels, and the emphasis is more on survival and resource management than killing enemies, it gives the gameplay a cerebral feel rarely seen in run-and-gun games. Sadly, the SNES controller can't keep up with your large arsenal of weapons. You simply don't have time to go through 10 different weapons to find the right one in situations where you're supposed to be able to do split-second decisions. It's a shame, as audio-visually, the game nails the cartoon horror homage vibe perfectly, and it has a sweet co-op mode as well. This concept could work really well in a PC game, or with a reworked control scheme that lets you quickly access every single weapon and item with the press of a button. Midnight Wanderers: Quest for the Chariot is a part of the Wonder 3 collection. It's more of an action platformer. It's sort of like Ghosts and Goblins, as when your character gets hit, he loses his clothes, and after that the second hit is fatal. While it looks quite nice, and there aren't any major technical or design flaws, the game is just too simple and indistinguishable for other action platformers to be interesting. However, it did warrant a home console port in Japan. Another more well-known title is Loaded for the original PlayStation and Sega Saturn, so I'll keep this brief as well. Loaded is a dark and gory top-down shooter that was, at its release, praised for its lighting and character designs by famous British comic book artists. The gameplay is closer to Alien Breed than twin-stick shooters like Smash TV, which is a shame. The level design is also needlessly maze-like for a game where you just want to run around shooting stuff. But it's still fun in small bursts. With better design and graphics, a shooter like this with dark 90s comic visuals could have been amazing. Since I mentioned abuse, I should mention some of the various Shareware games that were similar to it. First of all, there's Lyro and Soldat. Both are somewhat famous multiplayer games. Lyro is basically a real-time version of Worms that you play by sharing the keyboard with another player. while Soldat expanded the idea to online multiplayer and plays more like Counter-Strike in 2D. The weapons are very lethal, but you have a jetpack for avoiding enemy fire. At one point in time, Soldat was somewhat popular as an online game, probably because it was free. There were many single-player games done in this style as well. Since none of them are all that great, I'll just cover the two that I remember the most from my childhood. If you've ever visited Newgrounds, you're probably familiar with the Madness combat animation series. Madness fan games are practically their own genre in Newgrounds. The two I recall from my childhood are Madness Interactive and an online game where you killed other player characters for money and purchased better weapons and armor with that money. That game introduced me to the concept of grinding, but I don't think it exists anymore, so I can't play it. Interactive is a single-player experience, so you can still play it. It lets you create your own character and kill enemies either in an arcade mode or in a practice mode where you can spawn weapons and enemies as much as you like. The game mimics the style of the animation perfectly, and the gunplay feels pretty good as well. Sadly, the browser version sucks because your mouse constantly goes out of bounds, and I couldn't get the desktop version to work. Dark War II was made by a tiny Finnish developer called Blue Skull Entertainment. There's not much to this game. You kill orcs and skeletons and collect money, and with that money you can buy better weapons. Considering that it was made in some late 90s game-making program, I have to commend how good some of the weapons feel to use, like the railgun. The music rips off Doom's sound quite accurately.